It's a deep history, an amazing one. It's not a happy story like Cinderella loses the shoe and gets the other one back and all that. This is a painful one. And it's not a story where we are dealing with fables. We are dealing with human beings themselves. So it's a story that has to be told, but we have to tell it gently and carefully.
Sana sampaya yenkombo Sana sampaya yenkombo Sana sangwa yenkombo Sana sangwa yenkombo
You are all welcome to the slave camp. My name is Aaron Azuma, the senior-most side guide of the Pikworo slave camp. This slave camp was established around 1704. The first slave raider, he did a search. He surveyed the whole Narnia. Then he discovered this place.
There's a reason why Pikworo, as beautiful as it is, locals don't go in there. Because they're just traumatized many generations later. So I think when we look at our history as people who are black people in the world today, there is a lot that we have to contend with. The Europeans never went as far as Pikworo, but they were quite ingenious in creating this market and the structure that allowed for a whole industry of slave catchers and people to go and burn communities down and bring people to sell. You have to imagine someone who was captured from, say, Burkina Faso, brought into Ghana, into Pikworo slave camp, tied to a tree, if you were belligerent, tied to a stone under the scorching hot sun. So you're marched down to Salaga slave market, you are put on a bit of a stage, you're whipped, and some people then say, yeah, that one looks good. And then your journey continues until you get to Asim Manso, and you're finally allowed, after God knows how many weeks, to take a bath. And then you finally are now taken to where you think is your final destination, this gigantic, imposing stone structure that is either Cape Coast or Elmina or one of the castles along the coast. The British came here and, the first thing was, it's not just the British, but all the Europeans, was that they were coming to save souls. They were bringing Christ and they were bringing church. And it's very interesting that at any place where there's a slave dungeon, there's probably a chapel upstairs. And saying that they were going to save our souls, but at the same time they were selling us downstairs. And there were priests who were blessing these slave ships.
At the peak of it, the whole structure could talk of a minimum of 1,000 at a time. 600 men on the side, 400 women right in there.
Slave descendants have a unique linguistic heritage in comparison to every other immigrant group that came to this country. African slaves, when they were captured, were often isolated linguistically from others that spoke their own mother tongue while they were on the west coast of Africa. That linguistic isolation was also maintained on the ships during the Atlantic crossing. And as a result of that, not one indigenous African language has survived the Atlantic crossing intact. Once they got here, it was illegal to teach them to read and write. For hundreds of years, slaves were denied access to education. And as a result of that, many of the linguistic stereotypes, many of the negative linguistic stereotypes that people embrace regarding African American English, dismissing it as, the language of someone who's being lazy or not attending to language, doesn't fully appreciate the linguistic isolation that slave descendants experienced is unlike anything of any other immigrant group in this country.
When they were brought here, African Americans were segregated into plantations. That's what happened in the Caribbean also. And what they did was to invent new languages, new varieties, taking linguistic properties from the surrounding varieties and creating new forms. These are creations of people put in an absolutely horrible set of circumstances. And out of that milieu came new language forms.